Are you new to real estate, or are you just looking for a quick refresher on how to properly fill out the California Residential Purchase Agreement? You've come to the right place. I'm Cheyenne Terraciano, and this is the road to sold. Let's jump right in. Okay, the California Residential Purchase Agreement normally goes through 2 revisions per year. You can expect to see some type of a revision to your purchase agreement or 2 different types of disclosure, usually in or around December or in or around June. So for today's example, it is April of 2020, and we're working off the most recent revision of the California Purchase Agreement. To get started, it's just the date that you're preparing the offer. Today's date is April 1st of 2020, and that's the date the contract was prepared. The next line item is going to ask for your client's name. Now, it's very important that you pause right here and explain to your clients that what they write in this blank is going to be how they're legally going to be taking title, and they're also going to have to provide proof of identification to their lender and proof of identification to the notary when it comes time to sign their legal signatures throughout this transaction. So it's very frequent that your buyers don't go by their legal name. So in the example that I have here, I have President Trump, and in our example, he's purchasing his property with his daughter, Ivanka Trump. Now, we know that President Trump is probably going to be signing as his legal name Donald J. Trump. He's not writing this purchase agreement as Don Trump. So they would let you know at this point in time that they want to use their full name, a middle initial, and a last name. Now, we also know that Ivanka happens to be married. We don't know whether she signs her legal documents with her maiden name of Trump or whether she's taken a married name as far as signing this document goes. So it'd be very important at this point in time to double check with your clients how they want to go on title. Now, if you don't double check, you always can amend this at a later point in time, but if you have to do an amendment, it's going to mean going back to your clients and getting additional signatures, and you really don't want to have to create extra work for yourself or for your clients. So it's best to clear it up from the very beginning. Next up is just the property address. So we're purchasing today 1234 Superman Street, San Diego, California, and the zip code 92131. You're simply going to fill in the assessor's parcel number in the top right-hand corner and the purchase price that you've decided along with your clients that they want to purchase the home for. In this example, you'll see that we're offering $500,000 for the purchase price of Superman Street. Now, item number D is something that you want to pay very close attention to. You have the option for a close of escrow period to be on a specific date or days after acceptance. Now, it's pretty common in the state of California, especially in Southern California, to see people use days after acceptance, and they fill this in with a 30-day escrow or a 45-day escrow. Whatever suits your client's needs best is what you're going to fill in this section right here. But for our example, you'll see that I have filled in that we want our close of escrow to occur on May 6th. Why did I choose to select a specific date versus going 30 days after acceptance? Well, I'm asking you to pre-think the end of your transaction. Now, no matter how smooth we'd like for our transactions to be, the chances that it's going to close on the exact date that you planned sometimes doesn't always happen. And usually at the very end of a transaction, those last 2 to 3 days can get very anxiety filled, and there's a lot of stress on everybody's shoulders, and usually there's something that's not quite right that'll cause the escrow to be delayed by a day. So the one thing that I personally never want to see is to select a close of escrow date that would be on a Friday, because chances are you might be delayed by a day. And the worst time to be delayed by a single day or even 2 days is if you have a close of escrow set to a Thursday or a Friday. Now, your clients always want to close on a Thursday or a Friday because they want to plan their move that weekend. What I'm going to encourage you to do is calendar out your 30-day escrow or calendar out your 45-day escrow. Then it's best to choose a close of escrow date on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. Those were always my 2 favorites, Tuesday or Wednesday. Now, this is going to give an opportunity for a day or 2 of error, if you're going to budget that in there, And let's just hope and say that you selected a close of escrow date of a Tuesday, but there was a 2-day delay, so your close of escrow ended up happening on a Thursday. That's absolutely perfect, because then your client gets an opportunity to call the utility companies to get all the utilities switched over. They get a day to think about getting a maid service to come in and get the house nice and freshly cleaned, or the carpets cleaned in enough time. The only thing that you want to consider is if you're going to select a close of escrow date midweek and you're calendaring out 30 days, as you go through the countering phase back and forth with a seller, if it takes your seller 2 or 3 days to respond to your offer, and then you're going to reissue a counter offer back to them, you're cutting into your days of acceptance, or you're cutting into your contract days here. So be sure to keep track of whatever you're putting here for the close of escrow date, and making sure your lender is going to have enough time to get your transaction closed. But the best way that I could describe it is try to set a close of escrow date for a Tuesday or a Wednesday, but tell your buyer to anticipate that they might have to give a day or two of leeway, because towards the end of escrow, a lot of things can go wrong, okay? So setting expectations while you're writing this purchase contract is very important. Okay, now we're gonna move on. Now, item number 2 is agency. In letter A, it's talking about disclosure. Now, you'll see on line item for letter A, they've already checked the box. This means that the disclosure regarding agency relationship has been pulled into the transaction already. And agency is included as soon as you pull up the purchase agreement in your zipforms account. Next up, we're going to be talking about confirmation. Confirmation just wants to know who is the listing broker and who is representing the seller. Then it's going to ask who's the buyer's broker and who is representing the buyer. Now, in this scenario, basically what I've said here is that it's a dual agency. I said that RE/MAX United was the listing broker, and I also said that RE/MAX United was the buyer's broker. And I put myself for both of the agents on this transaction. Now, this isn't always going to happen, of course. Usually you're going to see a different listing broker and a different buyer broker, but for this scenario, I went ahead and did myself as a dual agent. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll see we'll fill it in with some sample license numbers. Be sure to fill in your cooperating agent's information. It's easy to find. It's always in your MLS detail report. Don't leave those blank. Let's make it easy for everybody. Now, below that, you'll see item number C is potentially competing buyers and sellers. This means that both brokerages may be a dual agent representing both sides of this transaction. This disclosure, since it's checked, is also pulled in to this transaction, and it's called the representation for more than one buyer or seller, and it's the disclosure and consent, and is also pulled in. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about the initial deposit. In this transaction, I put that the initial deposit was going to be $5,000. Now, the larger the deposit is, it makes it appear that your buyer is very serious, very qualified, and they have the funds available. Whatever your initial deposit is going to be held in an escrow account, and that is going to be your earnest money. Now, usually in Southern California, in our offices, you'll commonly see this amount be equivalent to a minimum of 1%. So we have a purchase price of $500,000. You'll see our initial deposit is $5,000. There are some marketplaces that would require a higher deposit than this, and a higher deposit would be normal. It's very important to understand that I'm talking about what a typical purchase agreement would look like in the marketplaces that I'm familiar with. Now, next up, very important to know that this $5,000 has the expectation, and it's naturally built into this contract, that the $5,000 is going to be delivered to escrow directly by electronic funds. Why is this? You don't ever want to touch a cashier's check or a personal check anymore in this day and age. You want your buyer to deliver the funds directly to escrow via electronic funds, which is a wire. If you touch this money at all, even if it's just to pick it up from your client and drop it off for them directly on their behalf to escrow, you're supposed to put it inside of a trust fund first. You're never supposed to touch a buyer's money. Next, you'll see a line item that's called increased deposit. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the contract when it comes to liquidated damages. It's not always common to see an increased deposit, but let's say your buyer doesn't have enough earnest money funds to make this enticing right now. Perhaps they're waiting for it to come in from a 401k or something other that could be a different scenario here. You could put a lower deposit, perhaps $2,000 as an initial deposit, and then you could always increase your deposit later. It's not common, but if you need to, you have this as an option. Next up is item number 3D. This is the loan section. If your buyers are going to be obtaining financing in order to purchase this property, you want to fill in what type of financing the seller can accept. If you're getting a conventional loan, you're not going to check any of the boxes. It's already built in. The loan will be conventional. So in this scenario, I'm getting conventional financing, and the first loan on this, the loan amount is going to be $400,000. If my client was getting FHA financing or VA financing, I would be sure to check one of these boxes. But in our scenario, we're going conventional with a $400,000 first loan. And under the rate, I put that I don't want the rate to exceed 4.5%. Now, what you want to do is always consider what the typical rate of the day is. So let's say today's rate happens to be 4%. It's pretty easy for a buyer to get 4%. Let's make that assumption. I gave us a 0.5 point pad right here because I want to say no matter what, my buyer is willing to proceed with this loan as long as they can get a 4.5% interest rate or better. Now remember, this is a portion of a contingency too. So if rates skyrocketed for some reason and we started seeing rates go 5%, 5.5%. It's not common to jump that high that fast, but you've got a protection built in for the buyer. Now, obviously, if you're a listing agent, you're also going to watch what rate was put here because you don't want a buyer backing out of the contract because rates did a slight fluctuation. But that's what the rate is there for. Usually, you'll see it's pretty common to fill in this first percentage rate, and it's not as common to get an adjustable rate loan with as good as rates are in today's marketplace. Okay, if your client's going to be getting a second, you're also supposed to be filling in the second. And if your client is going to be doing an FHA or VA loan, this clause will end up pulling in at that time. If your client is going to be asking for some closing costs paid by the seller, you would fill this in on item letter E right here under additional financing terms. So this would be buyer requests seller to pay for recurring and non-recurring closing costs not to exceed $5,000 or 2% or whatever that happens to be. Make sure you specify that you want the seller to pay for recurring and non-recurring closing costs because that is going to address both types of closing costs that can be paid for. Okay, towards the bottom of it, it's going to calculate the deposit and it's going to calculate the first loan, the balance of the amount that's going to be due to the transaction to meet the total purchase price of $500,000. Okay, next up, we're on page 2 of 10 of the purchase agreement. We're talking about verification of down payment and closing costs. They're supposed to supply this to the listing agent within 3 days after acceptance. It is most typical that the verification of down payment and closing costs is supplied with the offer up front. Any good listing agent is going to ask you for this. So to write a good, clean offer, you never want to rely upon this 3 days. You want to submit it up front if you're representing the buyer. Okay, next up is appraisal contingency and removal. In all of the purchase contracts, the appraisal contingency is set for a period of time of 17 days after acceptance. That is standard. If you need more time, you would fill it in right here to extend the contingency period for the appraisal to a longer period of time if you feel you need it. Now, your strongest offer is to leave it at 17 days or to lower it even if you're in a very tricky marketplace, but you want to pretty much leave it alone at 17 days. If you are representing a VA buyer, The only thing tricky with a VA buyer is your appraisers have a tendency to take their time with the appraisals because they have 10 days to get that back from the moment in time when it's ordered. So you are going to really tap close to this contingency period with a VA buyer. When I'm representing a VA buyer and writing a VA offer, I do have the tendency to want to extend this a little bit longer. Unless I need my offer to be as clean as possible, I leave it alone and make sure that VA appraisal is ordered day one because the time clock is ticking here. Okay. Next is loan applications. It's standard to leave all of these items alone under loan applications. It's expected that the loan application is going to be taken care of within 3 days after to acceptance. And the loan contingency period is up next. It's expected that the loan contingency period is going to be 21 days after acceptance. That gives the lender plenty enough time to make sure that the buyer is fully approved and to really click through any of their prior to loan doc conditions so that the buyer is able to remove their loan contingency within that 21-day period of time. Next up, you're going to see if this is no loan contingency. Well, why would you ever check a no loan contingency box? You would check this box if you're an all-cash buyer, right? You can also check this box to make your offer very strong. Like, no matter what, Mr. Seller, my buyer is going to close on this transaction. We don't even need a loan contingency. That's how committed we are. Most marketplaces in California, it would not be common to check this box. And it does not protect the buyer to protect that box. It only protects the seller, right? So it is more typical to leave this blank. You want the loan contingency to remain in effect for 21 days to best protect your buyer. Okay, now next up is the lender limits on buyer credits. A lot of people forget that this is in the contract, and what this means that if the seller is going to be offering a credit to the buyer, it must be approved by the lender. And if you get towards the closing of an escrow and you're trying to assist your buyer by offering them a credit for something that happened during the transaction, that credit also has to be approved by the lender. Any credit must be approved by the lender. So you want to be careful what you're offering a credit for because the lender does get the opportunity to approve that, okay? Next up, I have highlighted here in this teal green color that if it's going to be contingent upon the buyer selling their property, you need to make sure that you check line item B here and pull in this contingency form for the sale of the buyer's property as well. Now in our scenario, we are not contingent upon the buyer selling their home, so I've left this blank. Under number 5, you're going to move on to addenda and advisories. Now, anytime there's going to be additional addendas that you need to be careful or cautious of, you need to make sure you check the appropriate box and incorporate it into your purchase agreement. So on line item number A, you'll see that I've highlighted this teal section because there are a lot of properties that are on septic. If the property is on a septic, you need to pull in the septic, right? If your property is a short sale, you must pull in the short sale addendum. So you need to really read these sections and see if you need to attach anything or incorporate anything into your purchase agreement. The next line item is buyer and seller advisories. Now in here, you'll see that I personally checked the statewide buyer and seller. It is typical in our marketplace that the statewide buyer and seller is included in the purchase agreement. And the BIA, the buyer's inspection advisory, is naturally going to pull in. Now, if there are any other terms or addendums that you need to be attaching to this purchase agreement, you can fill it in on item number 6. Okay, great. Now we're going to move on to a very important part of the contract, and this is allocation of cost. Who is going to pay for what? Now, the very first line item here is very commonly and very typically paid by the seller. It is seller shall pay for the natural hazard zone disclosure report. Now, it's going to naturally check the box for the environmental report, and I recommend checking the box other and including the tax report. Now, down here, you can select if you want this prepared by a specific company or not. You'll see that in my sample today that I've just elected to put seller's choice, meaning I'm going to let the seller choose who they want to order this report from. Next, on line item number 2, this is a very debatable line item, and I want you to be cautious and to speak to your broker about what would be common in your office. It is common for the seller to pay for a termite inspection report. What is not common, or what is very debatable, is whether or not the seller is responsible to pay for Section 1 items to the termite inspection. Now, one of the revisions in the California purchase agreement years ago was they removed termite inspection out of the built-in inspections that was inside of here. So it used to say item number 2, seller shall pay for a termite inspection, including, and you got to check whether you wanted Section 1 or Section 2 items to be paid for by the seller. At that point in time, years ago, it was common for the seller to pay for Section 1 items. But what happened is the California Association of Realtors, they pulled that out of the contract because they did not want us to pre-negotiate who was paying for the Section 1 clearance, because we don't know how much money that would cost. So by filling in that you want the seller to pay for the termite inspection report is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. To fill in that you want the seller to pay for the termite inspection report and the Section 1 clearance, you're writing something into a purchase agreement that was purposely removed by the California Association of Realtors because you're trying to tie the seller to pay for an unknown amount. That is what they really don't want to happen. But the reason why I have it written here in this offer is because it's very common to still see buyer's agents write something like this on the contract. Now, above here in this teal green color, you'll see that CAR, when they pulled out this termite inspection, they wrote some interesting verbiage. It says, unless otherwise agreed in writing, this paragraph only determines who pays for the inspection, the test, or the certificate or report. It does not determine who is to pay for any work recommended by that report. So it's telling you right here that you're not supposed to pay for who is paying for Section 1 or Section 2 items inside the termite inspection report, but you're still seeing a lot of buyer's agents make this built into the agreement by typing it. Now, technically, inside of a purchase agreement, you can write anything you want to. You could ask for the seller to leave their dog at the property, but it's not common. It's not typical. It shouldn't be done there. It's not the right way. So the Section 1 is not supposed to be written into the contract like this. It's supposed to be handled through a request for repair when the termite inspection comes back to you. However, I highly recommend that when it comes to the termite inspection that you speak to your broker until you really find out what's typical and atypical in your marketplace and follow their lead on that. Now, you have another line item here for buyer or seller to pay for an additional report. You, of course, could include any sort of roof cert. You could ask for a mold inspection. You could ask for a pool inspection if there is a pool. There are things that you could fill in here if you want an additional inspection that you know is important to this house or that's important to your buyer. This is where you'd fill it in and who you expect to pay for it. You also want to put who you want to prepare the report in and of itself. All right. Now we're going to move on to government requirements and any retrofitting that needs to be done to the home. It is most common for you to check the box that states that the seller is going to pay for the smoke alarm and the carbon monoxide devices, and that those are going to be installed to the property prior to the close of escrow. Same thing with water heater bracing if it's required by law, which it is typical in the state of California. Now, it says here, and I've stated that it's supposed to be done prior to the close of escrow, which is correct. It is supposed to be done prior to the close of escrow. However, if when you're walking through the house, you notice there are no smoke alarms, there's no carbons, or that water heater is not braced properly, which is a third of the way up and a third of the way down, you want to have a conversation with the listing agent when you write the offer or when you submit the offer to them. And I would just write that in the body of the email, because what's going to end up happening is the appraiser is going to be the person who calls this out. So if your buyer is getting an FHA loan and they go to the property to get the appraisal done, and that appraiser notes that those items are not done correctly, Now you have to go back to the seller, ask for it to be repaired at that point in time, and then you're going to have to do a reinspection report from the appraiser, which is going to cost additional funds and take additional time. Now, if there is a very good listing agent on the other side of this transaction, you really don't have anything to worry about, because I personally address that issue at a listing appointment, and I make sure the sellers have that done prior to ever going on the market, because I don't want to have to deal with any of these problems later. But not all listing agents do their job that way. So when you're walking through the house, if you note that those items aren't done correctly, let's try to get it done before the appraiser goes out to the property, because it's just going to save time and money. Okay, moving on to page 3 of the contract. Page 3 up top, we're still talking about retrofits and any government mandated items that need to be taken care of. So it is common that the seller is going to pay for the cost of compliance with any other mandatory inspections or reports, and it's going to be done prior to the close of escrow. And you're also going to ask for the seller to pay for the cost of compliance with anything else that might happen to pop up, okay? Everything has to be done within the sale of the property prior to close of escrow. Item number C is escrow and title. Most commonly, you want to check buyer and seller. You're going to check both boxes here. This is frequently written incorrectly. You are supposed to check buyer and seller. The proper verbiage is each to pay their own, which means the buyer is going to pay for their own buyer's fees and the seller is going to pay for their seller fees. Frequently, I see agents make the mistake of writing 50-50. What that means is that you're instructing escrow to get the buyer's totals plus the seller's total, combine them together, and split it in half 50-50. That is not the correct way to do that. So be sure that you're filling in each to pay their own. Now, the strongest offer is going to be written to seller's choice, meaning you have allowed the listing agent and the seller to choose who the escrow company is going to be in this scenario. Now, if you have a specific escrow company that you love and you feel like they do an incredible job, yes, absolutely, you can fill in the escrow company. You may see this countered out. So if you're going in for multiple offers and you know that it's going to be a challenging property to get put into escrow, the cleanest way to write that is the escrow holder is seller's choice. Many of you may work for a brokerage that has their own escrow company. It's wonderful to be able to use your own escrow company because you can make sure your transaction gets handled and you know who to go to if there's a problem. It's much easier to be able to control the transaction if you trust the people who are involved alongside with you. But again, cleanest way is to write seller's choice in a competitive market. Okay, next up is for the title policy, for the title insurance. It's most common that the seller pays for the owner's title insurance policy, and you can fill this in again with your favorite title company or issued by seller's choice. Now, underneath that in parentheses, you'll also see that the buyer has their own responsibility to pay for any title insurance policy that's going to insure the buyer's lender. So there's two different things. There's insuring the buyer's lender, and then there's the owner's title insurance policy. Those are two different title policies that are there. Okay, moving on to other cost in line item D. It's most common, most typical that the seller is going to pay for the county and the city transfer taxes. Next up, you're going to see HOA information. If the property is located in a homeowners association, it's most common for the seller to pay for the fees that are associated with that. So for line item number 3 and for line item number 5, you would click seller shall pay for. If you're not in an HOA, then these would both be left blank. Item number 7. I have left this blank in this scenario for private transfer fees. Now, in the marketplace that I happen to be in Southern California, we don't see private transfer fees frequently, but there are areas that do have a private transfer fee and they can get costly. This would be one of those subjects where you'd want to find out in your local marketplace if this is typical or atypical, okay? Next, they have a few blank spots where you can fill in whatever other cost that you feel like you want to ask the seller to pay for, or whether you're going to say, look, my buyer is willing to pay for this inspection or report or whatever the case may be, but you have to tell the seller. You're going to disclose to them that you're going to be doing whatever it happens to be. Okay. Next up is line item number 10 on other cost, and this is going to be talking about the home warranty plan. It is pretty typical that most buyers ask for a home warranty plan. It's your job as the buyer's agent to look up the plans and make sure you're filling in the proper cost. In this specific scenario, I selected Old Republic Home Protection, but I wanted my buyers to get the upgraded policy to include the air conditioner. So when I pulled up Old Republic's pamphlet, to get the standard policy plus the upgrade to include the air conditioner, the cost was $465. And in this scenario, I'm going to ask for the seller to pay for that home warranty. If the market started getting really tricky and it was very competitive, but I wanted my buyer to get this home warranty still, you could select for the buyer to pay for it, but it is more typical for the seller to pay for that. Please be sure to check AC units. That's an important one here. Now, your buyer can always choose to get a home warranty plan at a later date if they would like to. So if they're choosing to waive that, they must check this box right here. But this home warranty covers the buyer for a period of a year for any major systems that could go wrong in their home. But you need to actually read the pamphlet, see what is covered and see what's not covered, and pass that on to the buyer so they know what to anticipate with the property. If you're enjoying the content so far, please be sure to hit the like button down below and subscribe to our channel. All right. Next, we're going to move on to items included and excluded from the sale. Now, if it's listed in the MLS or the flyers that they're not to be included, then it's not included. If it is listed that it is going to remain with the property, well, then it's supposed to remain with the property. If it is an existing fixture or fitting that is attached, that means it's included in the sale. Same thing with existing electrical, mechanical, lighting, etc. If it's attached to the property, it is supposed to remain with the property. Some things that we see being taken frequently would be water softeners and water purifiers and some specific security systems that may be on the home as well. Well, it's written into the contract that those are supposed to stay. So if the sellers want to take their water softener with them, they're supposed to disclose that to you. Otherwise, it stays with the home. Now, you do want to check that you want the stove to remain. That would be common. And sometimes having the refrigerator remain would be pretty common as well. So if you want the stove and you want to guarantee that the refrigerator is going to stay, you need to check the boxes. If you want the washer and dryer to stay, you need to fill in that box also for the washer and dryer. If there are any additional items that you would like to stay with the property, then you can fill it in on this line item here as well. As you move forward, you're going to see that leased or liened items are supposed to stay with the property as well, and the seller is supposed to deliver you copies or anything that has to do with those leased or liened items and systems within the home. Everything in their contract is built around sellers disclosing to buyers and buyers doing due diligence to find out the answers that they're seeking for the contract. Now, items excluded from sale. This talks about the actual audio and video components, like a flat screen TV is not going to be included with the sale. But interestingly, those flat screen TVs are attached to the property via the brackets that are attached to the wall. So in bold down here, you're going to see this addressed. It's going to say, okay, obviously the seller is going to take their own TV, and behind that TV, there's a bracket. What do you want to happen to the bracket? Do you want the bracket to remain with the property? Or you would check this box and say, look, Mr. Seller, please remove those brackets and patch the holes behind it. Now, understand the job that they're going to do to patch that is probably not going to be that of a professional, and it's definitely not going to be painted. So you're going to see where those brackets were removed at. Now, the contract naturally leaves the brackets attached to the wall. If you want the brackets removed, you must check the box. Now, on line item number A, you're supposed to state whether the buyer intends to occupy the property as their primary residence or whether they do not intend to occupy the property as a primary residence. So if this is an investment home, you're going to check this box right there. If it's a primary residence, you can leave everything alone. Now, it's going to auto default that this for a seller occupied or a vacant home, that as soon as this property closes escrow, or you'll see that I've highlighted in green that if you're going to give the seller close of escrow plus 2 days, that would give the seller an additional 2 days after the close of escrow. And again, you can select a day, time, whatever the case may be. Okay, you guys, moving on to page 4 of 10. At the top of page 4, items number C and items number D are going to address if you're going to allow the seller or the tenant to remain in possession of the home after the close of escrow. We really don't recommend that you allow the seller to remain in possession after the close of escrow. However, you will run across a scenario or two where you need to incorporate this clause into your purchase agreement. If that's happening to you, we do recommend that you speak to your broker of record or an experienced agent in your office that can help guide you during this process. I want to move down to paragraph 10. Paragraph 10 is going to take up the rest of the page on page 4, and it's going to talk about the disclosures that the seller is required to make to the buyer during a specified period of time in the contract. Now, the seller has the obligation to disclose any and all known material facts about their home, so that way they can provide the information to the buyer, giving the buyer enough time to do their own research on whether or not they have any additional questions or concerns that may have arose based upon the seller's disclosures. Paragraph 10 is going to discuss all of these different items that the seller is required to disclose. Very important to note is that you're not allowed to waive any of these disclosures. It's prohibited by law. Also important to note is that let's assume you're under contract. If something were to happen to the seller's property while you're under contract, let's say the dishwasher overflows and floods the property, the seller must immediately redisclose to the buyer any material facts that are happening in the home during the transaction. Moving forward to page 5. Page 5, item number 11, I have highlighted in teal, condition of property. This is a very important clause that's often overlooked or misunderstood about the contract, so I want to take the time to pause here. Every single house is listed in as-is condition. How you see it is how you're going to buy it. It's very important to recognize this because a lot of the times when you're showing a house as a buyer's agent and the buyer sees something they're not entirely satisfied with, a lot of buyer's agents are making the recommendation that, hey, it's okay, we're going to order inspections on the property. When we're done ordering inspections, we're going to ask for a request for repair and we'll ask the seller to fix it at that period of time. Now, does your buyer have the right to ask for a request for repair? Yes, they do. But they also need to know that that property is being sold in as-is condition with no repair work being done. Sometimes our buyer's agents are training that to our buyers to be an expectation, but it really shouldn't be. Paragraph number 12 is going to discuss the buyer's investigation of the property. So now it's your buyer's job to say, okay, thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. I see all the material facts that you've disclosed on this home, and I have some additional questions that I would like an answer to. You, as the buyer's agent, can order any additional investigations or reports on the home in order to help appease your buyer's curiosities. You want to make sure your buyer is very happy with the home that they purchase and help answer any questions that they have by ordering the proper reports to help guide them. Paragraph 13, title investing. When you have an accepted contract, your title company is going to issue a preliminary title report. That title report is going to take into consideration any items that are currently listed on the property, such as encumbrances, easements, CC&Rs. Those things are going to remain with the property. They follow the title to the next buyer of the home. What things will not remain on the property are going to be any type of monetary liens that are recorded on the seller's behalf. So the seller's first trust deed, any liens the seller may have, those will fall off that preliminary title report. It's very important for your buyers to consider how they want to take title or how they would like to vest onto the property. It's very important that you're not their counselor in this because there are significant legal and tax consequences that your buyer could have in the way they choose to hold vesting. We highly recommend that they talk to a tax advisor or their accountant to discuss how they should vest onto the property. Page 6 of 10 is very important. It's where we're going to tie all of these loose ends together and talk about the obligations that the seller has and the obligations that the buyer has and the time periods that's associated with those obligations. Now, we already know that the seller has the obligation to disclose any known material facts to the buyer. Well, the seller has 7 days in order to make that happen. So every disclosure, every form, every material fact that the seller knows must be completed and delivered to the buyer within those 7 days. Now, that leaves the buyer with 10 days after that to review all of the documentation that the seller has presented to them. And of course, they may have additional questions or concerns. And during that time, the buyer should be doing investigations to answer their own questions and concerns. They should order additional reports. They should ask the seller additional questions. At 17 days, the buyer should know whether or not they're comfortable in continuing with this transaction or not. They're supposed to say, yes, I want to continue, and therefore I'm going to remove my contingency and I'm going to accept the condition of this home. But that's not always the way this happens, right? Page 6 of 10 is really going to hit a pivotal moment in your transaction because the seller's made their disclosures, the buyer has read them, the buyer's ordered additional investigations, and now you're pulling all the details of this contract together. So you have copies of a termite inspection report. You might have copies of a mold report or a mold inspection on the home. You have copies of pool inspections, a general home inspection, and all of these details have come together. Now the buyer has maybe 10 different items that they're a little bit concerned about. Some of them may be government mandatory items that are required to be fixed, like smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, or the water heater bracing. But some of them may be less serious and just purely cosmetic. So at this point in time, it's up to the buyer's agent to draft a request for repair and submit it to the seller. Now, you'll note that in item number 14B2, I've highlighted in red, although the buyer has the right to make any request for repair that they want to, the seller has absolutely no obligation to agree to or even to respond to that request for repair. As you remember from earlier in the purchase agreement, we stated that the seller is selling their house in as-is condition. The buyer has the right to request that the seller makes a repair, but the seller has absolutely no obligation to agree to that request or even to respond to the request for repair. It is purely up to the seller if they would like to make any additional repairs to that home because they signed an agreement with you that stated you accepted the home in its as-is condition. So any request you make at this point does not need to be substantiated with a response. So at this point in time, you should have hit day 17 of this transaction, and the buyer is supposed to remove the contingency for the condition of the home. However, it gets interesting though, because the seller had 7 days to disclose all material facts that they know about the home, which then gives the buyer 10 days in between to do their own due diligence. Now, does the seller and the listing agent always give you documentation within that first 7 days of the purchase agreement? Chances are, no, they did not. So I've highlighted paragraph 14B3. This is a very important paragraph and clause within the purchase agreement because it states here that if the seller fails to disclose or report any material facts to the buyers within that 7-day period of time, your buyer gets additional time to make a determination whether or not they accept the condition of the property. Well, how much more time does the buyer get? The buyer gets a total of 5 days once all disclosures have been made. So let's say the seller does not deliver the buyer their mandatory disclosures within the first 7 days. Not only do they not do it within the first 7 days, but perhaps the seller finally gets all the documentation over to the buyer on day 17, which is extremely late. Well, now the buyer has those 17 days plus an additional 5 days to remove contingencies. So if the seller's late doing what they're supposed to do, well, then the buyer can be late doing what they're supposed to do. And that day is a 5-day period of time. All right, now the contingencies will continue. The only way that a contingency can be removed from the contract is if it's removed in writing. So you could be on day 30 of an escrow and the contingencies could still be fully in effect unless the buyer has in writing removed those. Okay, so that is continuation of contingency. When the buyer and seller has reached this pivotal point of the contract and the other party is failing to uphold their side of the contract, there are very specific steps that need to be taken in order to get the other party to perform properly. At this point in time, the parties would want to send a notice of buyer or seller to perform. Now, inside this notice of buyer or seller to perform, it states that they must give the other party at least 2 days to respond to that. One of the things that I see with a notice of buyer or seller to perform is I see agents try to take this 2 days and make it 1 day. But it states right here that you must give them at least 2 days. So it means that you must grant a minimum of 2 days. If you're going to fill in anything in the blank, you can extend that to 3 days, but you can't make it less than 2. Once you've completed a notice of buyer to perform or a notice of seller to perform, and you've let the minimum of 2 days click by, you then have to send a demand to close escrow. You'll most commonly see a notice of buyer to perform on day 17 or day 21 of your real estate contract. Usually the seller will draft a notice of buyer to perform demanding that the buyer remove any applicable contingency that was supposed to be removed on that date. The buyer then has that 2-day period of time to respond to the notice of buyer to perform by removing those contingencies. Now, it's very important to recognize if the buyer does remove the contingency, then their deposit can become at risk. But if they don't remove the contingencies, then the seller has the right to cancel because the buyer's not upholding their side of the contract. So now that we've worked our way through pivotal request and request for repair, and we've worked our way through the contingency removal process, we're kind of sitting at day 17 to day 30. Now, at this point in time, hopefully the buyers have removed their contingencies. They've accepted the condition of the home and they're really ready to close escrow. You start getting towards the end of this transaction and really wrapping things up. It's time for loan documents, it's time for notary signing, and it's time to get this deal closed and handled. But perhaps something happens those last few days of escrow that's causing the escrow or the transaction to be delayed, and you're now past your close of escrow date. It's time for the seller to send the buyer a demand to close escrow, giving them a specified period of time to make sure they get it closed, or the seller still has the right to cancel. So item number G right here, you're going to see under close of escrow that before the buyer or a seller is able to cancel an agreement for failure for the other party to contractually act, that they must send a demand to close escrow first. The demand to close escrow may not be delivered any earlier than 3 days prior to the regularly scheduled close of escrow date. A lot of times sellers or buyers will think they're a little bit tricky and they'll just start automatically sending this DCE 5 days prior to the close of escrow to give them the protection to be able to cancel if the buyer's not performing. But it doesn't work that way. You're not allowed to send this any earlier than 3 days prior to the close of escrow. At any time during this transaction, if the seller and buyer decide for one reason or another that they need or want to cancel this contract, we need to discuss what's going to happen to that deposit. Now, it can get a little convoluted because it depends upon what has happened in the transaction so far that's led to the cancellation and whether or not the contingencies are still in effect or not. If a transaction is canceled within the first 17 days of the transaction, usually the deposit should go back to the buyer because the assumption is that buyer has not removed those contingencies yet. If there's a cancellation of the contract after day 17 and day 21 of the purchase agreement and the buyer has removed all of the contingencies, then really that deposit should go to the seller. Now, there's a huge gray area in the center of a transaction. The determining factor on what's going to happen with this cancellation and how the deposit is going to be returned is whether or not we have contingencies that have been removed or whether or not the contingencies have not been removed. The cancellation of contract and the release of the buyer's deposit are two totally different actions within the purchase agreement. Regardless of what day the transaction is canceled on, it's very important to understand that in order to release the funds that are held as a deposit is going to take two signatures authorizing that release. The seller and the buyer have to agree what happens to the deposit upon the cancellation of a contract. Usually, if you run into a circumstance where there's a cancellation of the contract and you happen to be anywhere in the middle of a transaction and towards the end of the transaction, I'll tell you right now that the buyer and seller are not going to agree on what should happen to that deposit. And there's going to be a lot of back and forth arguing over how exactly that deposit should be released. That we're supposed to have a mutually signed release instructing the escrow company on how they're authorized to release those funds. Now, there are some other stipulations and there are some specific ways that escrow is supposed to handle that, and that's detailed out in paragraph H. The most important thing for you to understand on the entire page 6 of 10 of this purchase agreement is that everything comes down to managing contingencies. If you're the listing agent on a property, it's your obligation to make sure your seller is meeting their timeframes appropriately. You're doing all of your disclosures within those first 7 days, so that way the buyer doesn't have any reason to come back to you and state that you failed to disclose within a timely manner. It's also your obligation as the listing agent to make sure that the buyer is removing their contingencies when they're supposed to be removing their contingencies. If the buyer is failing to remove those contingencies, it's very important that you issue the notice of buyer to perform, telling the other party that they have 2 days to remove the contingency, or you as the sellers have the right to cancel. The number one reason why deals start going sideways is because agents are generally not proactive enough in managing these contingency periods. So be on top of your files and make sure that you're the real estate professional that your client deserves. Your buyers have the right to do a final verification and walkthrough of the property. It's recommended within 5 days prior to it closing escrow, but it is not a contingency of the sale if they're dissatisfied, okay? Now, if any repairs were done to the property, so let's say the buyer did ask for a request for repair and they asked for the seller to repair or replace the dishwasher. The seller is supposed to give a copy of the invoice, receipts, or any documentation of that repair to the buyer. It's uncommon for the seller to do this, but if I were representing the buyer, I would make sure I had copies of any and all work done to the home prior to the close of escrow. Okay, prorations of property taxes and any other items. This is going to be handled during your escrow period. And what are we talking about here? Primarily, we're talking about insurance and we're talking about taxes. The escrow company is going to do prorations. They're going to debit and credit the buyer and seller appropriately for when their specific client owned the home. So the seller is going to be paying the taxes for the period of time where they owned the home, and the buyer will be responsible for paying taxes when they owned the home. Sometimes it's a debit to one and a credit to the other, depending upon whether or not the taxes have been paid and when the taxes have been paid. So you don't need to worry about it. Escrow is going to handle the prorations on this for you. Purchase agreement also acts as joint escrow instructions, and even though it does ask for joint escrow instructions, if you are working in Southern California, then your escrow company is going to draft an additional set of escrow instructions. Okay, now we're moving on, and we are on page 8 of 10 of your purchase agreement, and we're going to be talking about the remedies for a breach of contract. And what we're going to be talking about first is liquidated damages. So what does liquidated damages equal? It equals the amount no more than 3% of the purchase price, or it equals the deposit actually paid. So if your deposit was only 1%, well, then your liquidated damages would only equal that 1%. But it definitely will be no more than 3% of the purchase price, okay? Now, I've highlighted this additional section because if you'll remember on page 1, we talked about whether or not the buyer needed to include an increased deposit. Now, if the buyer increases the deposit, you need to also sign a separate liquidated damages provision for incorporating that increased deposit into liquidated damages. Because this line item that talks about the deposit that's actually paid, that's just talking about the very first initial earnest money deposit. It does not take into consideration any increased deposit, and it won't unless you pull in this separate provision on Form RID. So that's very important to note. Okay, now if your buyers initial this, then the sellers must initial it. Or the sellers can ask for the buyer to remove the liquidated damages clause from the contract. Most importantly for you to be aware of is they have to match. So buyer and seller must agree to have liquidated damages incorporated into the contract, or they must agree to leave it blank one way or another. For the dispute resolution, we're talking about mediation and arbitration. Now, line item number A is saying that if there's a problem in this transaction, the parties, the seller and the buyer, are going to agree to go to mediation prior to doing anything else. Next would be arbitration disputes. Now, arbitration is also optional, and it's the same thing. They must agree on whether to do arbitration or not agree. Initial items have to match on this section as well. The next section, we're talking about selection of service providers. It's not up to just the seller to select services. You're not really supposed to write seller to select services in most multiple listing services. It's supposed to be a negotiation between the buyer and the seller contractually. So whatever you guys agree upon in this purchase agreement is who the service providers are going to be. Down here to time is of the essence. Make sure you guys are following the timelines. This is a legal contract, so you want to make sure that everything is being babysat from beginning to end and making sure that everyone's being aware that we're on a timeline here. So the only time you can extend this is if you do it in writing. So if you need to extend a timeline, a contingency period, or anything else, that must be signed and agreed upon by all parties. So the buyer and seller both have to agree to that in writing. Section number 30 is just talking about some confusing definitions that may be inside the purchase agreement that you can read through. Next up, for line item number 31, for the expiration of offer, means from the day that you type up the offer and you send this over to the listing agent, that they have 3 days to respond to your offer. Or you can fill it in if you want a response by a specific date or time. Most listing agents, they kind of ignore the expiration of the offer. They plan to present all offers to their seller on a specified day, and they usually try to give their sellers a few days to gather offers up and present all offers at the same exact time. Depends upon which type of market you're in, whether the market is going up or whether the market is going down. But this frequently a listing agent can ignore no matter what you fill in, but they should communicate back to you when they expect to present offers to the seller. And I do normally ask the listing agent when I submit the offer via email to them when they anticipate presenting, so that way I can communicate with my buyers. Okay, now at the bottom of the form, we're just signing and dating offers to complete this so that we could submit it over to the listing agent. And these are all just different confirmations of that. Inside this section right here, you're going to make sure you fill it out if you're representing the buyer with all of your name, your date, your license numbers. And if you have the seller's brokerage information, you should fill out that as well. And it's all located on your MLS detail sheet. Complete it because it just makes your offer look much cleaner. If you found value in today's content, then make sure you subscribe below. We're going to have more awesome videos coming your way soon. I'm Cheyenne Terracciano, and this is The Road to Sold.